G'day, welcome back to the electric CRF build. This episode we're going to get more of that good gear in there. Just want to clarify some errors from episode 1, particularly with regards to how I mounted this motor. Now it's in the right spot now, but I had a bum steer on the first video, specifically when I was talking about the spacer. Now the spacer, as you can see there, actually sits there on the chain side between the end of the swing arm and the motor mount. It does not go in the middle there between the lugs like I assumed it did. So yeah, so that gives you the correct position and alignment of the motor and the position of the gear, which means it ended up, this stainless bracket was hard against this alloy lug. So that's just clarified. This is in the correct position to take the battery pack. And on the other side here, I've knocked up a spacer that fit in there between that lug and this position here. So that's all good. So next stage is we're going to mount the controller. This is our controller here, and it mounts in the factory airbox enclosure. And to make that happen, I've cut this aluminium plate that it's going to mount on. Then the plate's going to mount into the airbox like so. Can be bolted down in there with some stainless steel nuts and bolts and nylock washers. And that's what's going to hold the brains of the operation, certainly not me, this thing, in place. Okay, so the controller's now bolted to its mounting plate. And the way I've done that, right or wrong, is I drilled 6 holes, 3 on each side, in line with the edge of the controller, and the bolts actually just pass through, and then those washers just clamp it down, as you can see. So that's how I've chosen to mount it. And it seems quite solid. Nothing wants to move. Doesn't slide off the bracket or anything. And I've just nipped those nylock nuts up, stainless steel. So it's effectively clamped in there. The next step is that plate can be bolted into the factory airbox. So that's that done. The controller and its plate is now bolted to the airbox. It's really nice and solid. I'm happy with that. Nothing's going to move anywhere. She's rock solid. I've put 3 bolts, one there, one in the side there through to an angle bracket, and that's securely held in place. And now this needs to go back into the bike. Alright, so the airbox is back in with the controller in place, but we've got a bit of a problem. So I'll just move these cables out of the way. You can see down there that the way I've orientated the controller, which is with the connectors at the base, there's no way you're going to be able to plug those in because they're fouling with the shock spring at the rear. So I've either got to move the controller up, or what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take it all out and just turn it around 180 degrees, because there appears like there's plenty of length on the cables. That's one of the plugs that goes to the control unit, and it would easily go up the top there. So even though I've seen it done this way before, I'm going to spin it around the other way, see how that goes. Okay, so that's all done, and I'm much happier with it around this way. As you can see, the connectors are at the top now, and there's nothing that needs to plug in down near where the shock is. So the only thing that was going to catch me out is if there wasn't enough length on anything. And this harness, for example, plugs in there, and it reaches really easily without anything being tight, and the motor connectors will just nicely go onto those terminals. So yeah, so I'm pretty happy with that. So now I'm going to finish bolting all the airbox assembly back in properly, put the inner rear wheel guard in and everything, and then we can move on. So just one final thing to check before I move on and call this controller satisfactorily mounted. Just with the plugs up the top here, the one final thing I want to check is make sure I've got enough clearance from the underside of the seat to make sure it doesn't foul on anything or put any pressure on these connectors. I'm just going to plug this one in because it's easy to do. The other one's the same height. And then I'm just going to test fit and mock up the seat in its position to make sure we're not fouling anything. And it looks like we've got about 10mm clearance there, so we're all good. Well, that's that done, guys. I'm happy with how that's sitting in there now. I'll show you how it's positioned. So it's tucked up in there. It's well away from the shock. Those wires and stuff will be kept away and out of harm's way. So yeah, so the controller's in there, sits well, it's got all good clearance to everything. Plastics are back on now. So we can call that job done and on to the next thing on the list. So what's next? Well, the battery pack. As I said before, it's in two parts. The smaller part goes above the engine here, picks up the old top of engine mount, and the larger part mounts here and picks up that bracket that we put in earlier when we mounted the motor. And then those side panels kind of join them all together. But before we chuck them in the bike, let's chuck them on the scales. This is the little one. It weighs a little under 6.5. Now for the big one, it weighs a little over 19. So there's the total there, 25.7. So that's all pretty cool, knowing about the weights and stuff. But I mean, ultimately, it's not really relevant, but it's information. And at the end of this whole conversion, then, you know, it might be something worthwhile to weigh this full e-bike against a standard CRF 250 if I can find one. But all good, cracking on with the build. So now the battery packs have got to go in the bike. There's just a couple more things I've got to do to prepare the frame before they can go in. And specifically they involve cutting this lug off the left hand side because it's not needed for anything. And the weld right about there is a little bit bulky and kind of in the way of where the battery pack's going to sit, so that's going to go. I've got this little dag here that I'm going to grind down and clean up. The front of the frame here needs a little bit of linishing just to give a little bit more extra clearance. As I said, the battery packs take up all the available space, so this needs to be thinned out a bit here, this area. And then at the top where the smaller battery pack mounts, we only need this lower hole in this factory bracket that held the engine before, the old petrol engine. So I'm going to cut off the area where you can see where I've marked it. That's all going to go and get cleaned up just for simplicity more than anything, and because I know it's not going to be needed for anything. So that's the last of the frame prep done. Lug's cut off there, it's been ground back there, and the top mount has been cut off, simplified, and now we're ready to install the batteries. And that's the batteries installed. So you can see the larger one, you can see the space and clearance is very tight. The smaller one bolts the top here through that mount. The larger one bolts from underneath in that bracket there. So yeah, so that's the batteries installed. So the next job is to fit these folded aluminium fabricated powder coated side panels and these pieces here go between the batteries and basically support them and pick up these mounting points here on the frame. So I'm going to fit these now. Side panels for the battery packs are all installed. Ties everything together. So the bolts up the frame there, bolts onto the front edge of the larger battery pack, and then it picks up the back of the smaller battery pack, and that just basically ties it all in as one unit now. Nothing's going to move. That's all solidly mounted, so it's on to the next job. Next job is to get the rear wheel off so I can fit this new sprocket. Back wheel's off, ready to swap the sprocket over. This is the new one, obviously. Different number of teeth, different pitch because there's a different chain involved to match what's on the electric motor. And this is my factory one, and we've got a bit of a problem. If I lift this out of the way, you can see that 2 out of the 6 ears on here that mount to the sprocket are busted. So 2 out of 6 ain't bad, I hear you say. Well, while it's potentially possible to use this hub, on closer inspection the rest of the holes are really oversized and it's just worn and cactus. So the torque that the electric motor is going to be putting out, this is not going to last very long. So it can't be repaired, it's cast aluminium, it has to be replaced. So I'm going to have to strip the tyre, you have to delace the wheel, replace the hub, relace it, do all that and fix it up. So that's before I can bolt our new sprocket on, unfortunately. So that's a bit of a snag I wasn't expecting, but that happens with these sorts of things. But that's a problem for another day. That's going to be the end of this episode, guys. Thanks for staying with me. I hope you've enjoyed the watch, and join us next time when we crack on and finish this thing.